Movie theaters, that's what I'm talking about today. I like them, they're cool. I like walking in, I like seeing all the posters, I like spending my life savings on candy popcorn and then spilling half that popcorn while I'm walking to my seat. And my favorite part is when I finally sit down in my chair and then I remember I bought tickets to Joker 2. You know, as someone who loves sitting, I can tell you I feel right at home in movie theaters. I love being around people, especially when they aren't talking to me and I don't have to talk to them, which is actually the real reason I go to theaters. I don't even watch the movie. Okay, but all jokes aside, I do want to talk about something that's been on my mind for a while, and that's the gradual decline of movie theaters. In his acceptance speech for Best Director, Sean Baker asked for other filmmakers to continue making movies for theaters. His speech seemed to garner a lot of support, and for good reason, as it seems like every day less and less people are attending movies. I'm going to talk briefly about the history of movie theaters just so we have a background on everything. The first public movie theaters came out in the early 1900s, and for just a nickel, moviegoers would be shown a small selection of films, and these theaters were known as Nickelodeons, but not the one you're thinking of. It wasn't long before Nickelodeons basically took over as the most popular way to view movies, as it was much simpler than the previous method, which was to have this machine called a kinetoscope, which had a peephole that you could look through and see whatever was being shown. Not only were Nickelodeons extremely popular, but you could honestly argue that they were responsible for movies being seen as actual art.
It's art.
If you can believe it, there was a time where movies weren't really seen as an artistic medium. They were seen more as like toys or novelties, kind of like how video games were seen back in the 1980s. On top of their general ease of viewing, Nickelodeons could be viewed by citizens of basically all classes, as they were relatively cheap at the time. I also want to stress that most films shown in Nickelodeons were only around 15 to 20 minutes long, which are a far cry from what would become the standard for feature-length films. Okay, so now that we've established that Nickelodeons were really popular, let's talk about what came next. Well, naturally, the upper class decided they wanted in, but they looked at Nickelodeons and they said, "You're broke!" No, they needed highbrow cinema. So someone basically went, what if we made Nickelodeons but for people with money? Genius, they thought, and so they created the first movie palaces, which were basically movie theaters that were a lot bigger and more lavish to accommodate the increased admission prices. Not long after, the Great Depression hit, everybody lost their money, and suddenly nobody could afford to go to the movies anymore. Because of the sharp drop in attendance, around 8,000 movie theaters across the United States were forced to shut down. Although, there was a silver lining to all of this. Since people could no longer afford movie tickets, theaters began to cut back on admission prices, and so going to see a movie became much less expensive. But less money for tickets meant less money for the theater, and that presented a problem. You see, most theaters get roughly about 40% of the profit for each ticket sold. The rest usually goes to the studio. So during the 1930s, in the midst of everything, movie theaters couldn't survive off of just ticket sales alone, so they began searching for a way to boost revenue. And what's a good way to get people to spend extra money? Scam them into buying snacks. So yeah, around this time, theaters began offering concessions, the most popular of which was popcorn. Popcorn was already a rather popular snack in that era, as it was relatively cheap to both buy and produce. I should also note that prior to the Great Depression, food wasn't really allowed in movie theaters, as people claimed it would disrupt the high-class environment. But as history has taught us, people like food. So it became common for vendors not affiliated with theater just stand outside the building and offer popcorn to people as they were leaving. The theater company executives saw how profitable this was and decided it would be good for money. Not long after, they began selling popcorn officially. Jumping ahead a bit to the 1950s, drive-in movie theaters became popular because what's better than watching a movie? Cars. Drive-in movie theaters were initially advertised as being a sort of a more flexible method of movie watching. Being in the privacy of your car meant you didn't have to worry about restrictions on things like smoking and drinking. Plus, now you could bring your own food, because why eat popcorn when you could eat something that'll take years off your lifespan? It was also around this time that television saw a dramatic rise in popularity with the creation of various news and entertainment programs. Television was especially appealing to marketers as they could run advertisements in between blocks, not to mention it was also a more convenient way of viewing media. We'll come back to the idea of convenience in a bit, but suffice to say, when it comes to entertainment, convenience will almost always reign supreme. Jumping ahead a bit to the 70s and 80s, we saw the rise of VHS and VCR. And not to sound dramatic, but this completely changed everything. For the first time, audiences at home actually had control over what movie they wanted to watch. You just shoved in the tape, and the next thing you knew, you were watching Jaws 3D. And the best part? No going to the movie theater meant no being around people. Oh, and commercials? Yeah, not a thing. It's not a stretch to say that the VHS and the VCR were what truly lifted the limitations people had on viewing films. I mentioned convenience before because in some ways I think the rise of television and VHS was actually a sign of things to come. Part of what made these things so popular was how easy it was And you can see that same sentiment being shared today with streaming services and on-demand video has become the most popular way to view movies and shows. Movie theaters themselves have been on a decline for a little while now, and I think much of that can be attributed to an overabundance of content provided by streaming services. It's pretty easy to see why. After all, why spend the gas money to drive down to the theater and then pay another $10 on a ticket when you have access to thousands of movies right from your TV? I'm not saying this to try and act like streaming has killed cinema, because it hasn't. I actually think streaming has done a lot of good for the film industry, allowing films of all kinds to be viewed by a broader audience. But like many things, this is a double-edged sword. Previously, if there was a particular movie you wanted to see, you either had to see it in theaters, rent it at a Blockbuster, or hope a rerun got played on TV. Now, even movies that are released in theaters are being moved to streaming services, sometimes only weeks after their release. Because of this decrease in attendance, we're seeing a record number of movies straight up bombing at the box office. So that brings me to the question of, what's the solution, and is there any hope for movie theaters in the future? Well, I would say yes. The film industry is one that's always changing, and with that change, studios are looking for new ways to innovate and bring renewed interest to their projects. We've already seen some of these innovations as studios have begun to utilize the influence of the internet with movies like Oppenheimer and Barbie. Even more recently, we saw similar things with the release of the special popcorn buckets for Dune 2 and a marketing strategy which many films since have begun to employ. So basically, the point I'm trying to make with all this is that all things are going to change with the passage of time. There's no way to stop it. I think it's silly to say that movies or movie theaters are going to become irrelevant or are irrelevant, because they're not. Like any form of media, film will continue to adapt to growing industry changes. As long as audiences keep watching movies, movies will continue to be made.